This is the Nintendo Entertainment System version of Silent Service. I overwhelmingly prefer this to the original, actually. The gameplay controls, at least, are much smoother, I think, and easier to use. Although, getting through it with this pointer-based interface is a little bit awkward without a mouse. You have to learn how to use a Nintendo controller. But you can see the settings are pretty much the same as the original. But the graphics are much better, the sound is much better. Really, I think everything is improved. But the essential game is the same. So we have here the largest scale of map, which would also be your, or similar to your patrol map. But here we're doing the practice run again. And one thing you'll notice right away is how much slower everything is. There is what I think are the overwhelmingly superior graphics for the interior. This one's a little bit cartoonish, but it's still, I think, better because it's easier to read. And you can see there that the speed is probably a little bit too fast still, but it's not quite as unrealistic as the original version. You can put the periscope up or down that way, but you don't have to in this version. It will put it up automatically if you select the periscope. And you don't have to set up your attack table manually. It will operate automatically. So here, I'm a little bit too far out to actually take a shot on this scrap ship. So I'm going to do a little tour of the sub here instead. This practice run is supposed to be happening off Midway Island, but I've looked up Midway Island on Google Earth and it really isn't shaped anything like that. And the same thing goes for the DOS version. The DOS version uses the same essential shape, and as far as I know, that's not accurate, which makes me wonder whether they used a different island for the model and then got confused. Realistically, if you're closer to the island and you dive deep, you can touch the bottom, and you'll see that later, actually. Here's the damage view. And as in the DOS version, that is SS-104, or R-27, which was a submarine not used in World War II. And you can check the log. Nothing yet in it, of course. And because the time scale is realistic, it's taking a really long time for the submarine to get out there. You can see it's only going about 5 knots. That's accurate for the period. Even if modern submarines are as fast as surface ships, World War II submarines certainly were not. It's unclear, as in the DOS version, what class of submarine this is. It's certainly not an R class, because I've done deeper dives with it than an R class could tolerate. It may be intended as a Porpoise class, possibly, since that's the oldest class in the game that is actually named in the form of the plunger. But the reality is they used the older subs in World War II for training and the later ones for actual combat, even though some pretty earlier ones found their way into combat, actually. So now we're closer to that sub. Still pretty far away, but a little bit less so than before, so I'll attempt a torpedo shot here on it. Realistically, I'll pull down the periscope. The slower timescale makes it possible to operate the sub more realistically, of course, because in actual combat in World War II, they would use the periscope to aim, and then they would pull it down to hide and listen for the explosion, and if they heard anything, they could verify the kill with another look up the periscope. But stealth, of course, was the only real advantage of a submarine. And that's always been the point, so it's necessary to prioritize stealth. Even if you think you have a pretty nice sub. And as in the original DOS version of Silent Service, you somewhat realistically get mixed results from your torpedoes. So one might sink the ship, one might not. You might need 3, you might need a fair amount. But you also have duds if you really crank the realism settings up, but in this case I've gone without them. So, just in explosions. There, the ship went down, so now I will turn the sub, go to the next scrap ship here, and this could take a while because, as I said, the time scale in this version of Silent Service is much more realistic than in the original. And even though all these ships are very close together, there's very little challenge in any of this. The distances are pretty far for a quick playthrough on YouTube in a World War II sub. Or possibly pre-war, as I said before. If this were the oldest class of the game, it would be a Porpoise, and the Porpoises are early 30s, early. Here I'm diving deep to show that you could do it, partly. But obviously, when a submarine is on the move, it doesn't have to be at periscope depth. Generally, you want to be pretty deep to avoid detection, if possible. Again, stealth should be the priority. A lot of history textbooks talk about how submarines in World War II spent most of their time on the surface and would only dive to attack or to escape. But if you look at the specifications of them, a lot of them could stay submerged all day. So if they were in hostile territory, they could stay submerged all day and then recharge their batteries at night when they were much harder to detect on the surface. In the 1950s, there was a television series about the World War II submarines called Silent Service. You can look that up online. And there are a number of stories in that one, most notably in the first episode about how when submarines were in hostile territory in World War II, they did generally operate submerged if it was in daylight. And that would mean being probably below periscope depth a lot of the time, as with a modern sub. A lot of the technology they had on board was also more advanced than people realize. For example, it was possible to extract oxygen from the water on later models. So they were limited more by battery power for their motors, as well as by provisions, but provisions were more in line with their fuel capacity, because their fuel obviously mattered. Without fuel, they couldn't charge the batteries and they couldn't really go anywhere. They would just be stranded. So in any case, on to the next part.